Hi. Oh, a little bit more, right? Oh, thanks. So, I'd like to tell you guys a story. But I have to admit, when I first got here, when I first moved to Amsterdam, I was really suspicious about stories. You see, I had seen these shared stories do a lot of damage. I used to work in theater, and you have to understand, in New York theater, we all knew that theater was this progressive, liberal industry. And because we all knew in our bones how liberal and progressive this industry was, no one saw sexual harassment or racist microaggressions unless they experienced them. And no one saw the way that hiring mostly cis white men to do plays mostly written by cis white men, mostly about cis white men, really contributed to the inequality that we all knew in our guts we were against. And you can hear from my accent, right, that I'm American. I moved here in 2017, so you can kind of guess why I moved here. And I had seen that election do real damage in my country. And part of the reason that election had done so much damage, it was based on a story about who we were and how we got there. And that story had nothing to do with fact, but it made people really angry. So I have to admit, I was a little bit broken when I moved here. I didn't trust stories or storytelling, and I wanted desperately to believe in something. And I have to admit, the one brought me the other. You see, when I moved, the first thing I saw is every flat surface, and the Zelflecken, so not even just flat surfaces, had posters for Soldier of Orange. Right? I know, they still do. And if you don't know, sounds like a lot of you do, but if you don't know what that is, it's a musical based on a movie, based on a true story, but it's mostly about Gentile men in the resistance. And it felt like every white Gentile person I met said that their grandfather, always their grandfather, was in the resistance. But then, as I started to do research, I started to find stories like Frida Bellinfante. Oh, I'm gonna like you guys. Before the war, Frida was already really well known. She was the first woman in Europe to lead an orchestra. Her chamber orchestra played regularly at the Concertgebouw. And she was also pretty open about her sexuality. She lived with women, usually musicians or artists. They always kind of looked glamorous to me. And she had her father was a Jewish musician, so her father was also fairly well known. So between her Jewish family and her open sexuality, she had every reason to run when the Nazis invaded. And instead, she and her friend Willem decided they were going to fight. Willem Arondius was an openly gay painter. And Frida said later that they knew that they were going to die, but they wanted their deaths to matter. So they joined Group 2000, and they started working on forgeries. And Frida was a really good forger. But they started realizing the problem with these forgeries is as long as the city records exist, you can just compare the forgery to the city records. So one night, Willem was part of a group of men that went into the city records, knocked out the two janitors, dragged them out of the building, and blew up the city register. 800,000 records were destroyed. And they got 50,000 guilders for the resistance and 600 passbooks, which were much more valuable than the guilders. And the Nazis were enraged. They put a lot of energy into tracking down Willem and the men who were with him. Willem was executed, and his last words were, "Let this show that gay men are not cowards." Frida tried to stay. She was kind of going from safe house to safe house because she really wanted to stay in the resistance. But she started to realize that she was actually endangering the people she stayed with because the Nazis were still looking for her. So she did this escape that I cannot even tell you how she survived. She snuck down the Netherlands, down Belgium, into occupied France. And she made it all the way to this farmhouse about 2 kilometers from the border with Switzerland. And there was a huge blizzard going on. And the couple that owned this farmhouse said, "What are you doing? You have to go back." And Frida said, "There's no back to go to." So she walks in this snowstorm 2 kilometers to the river. And then when she gets to the river, she strips down and crosses this freezing river with her clothes held over her head and gets into Switzerland. Meanwhile, back in Amsterdam, Group 2000 has continued to work. And they've done incredibly well. I don't know if you've heard the name of Jacoba van Tongeren. She's now part of the Resistance Museum. And in the Resistance Museum, they call her the ration card queen, which I think undermines what was so special about Group 2000. One of the things that was really difficult about keeping someone in hiding was that it was really hard to feed people. Nazis were the only ones getting full rations. White Protestant Dutch people were getting about 2/3, and then depending on where you were in the Nazi kind of chart, everyone else was getting less. So it was really, really hard to feed someone if you were hiding them, except for Group 2000. The forgeries that they were doing helped keep thousands of people in hiding during the war. And Jacoba was she was so organized. She had all of these different codes. Like the reason it's called Group 2000 is because 2000 was her code and everyone else had these numeric codes. And then near the end of the war, the Nazis raided their office. And when they raided the office, they found an old code book. And Jacoba said, "Don't worry about it, it's an old book, it's fine." But some members of her group didn't listen to her. And they tried to steal it back. And in revenge, the Nazis executed about 30 people. And they left their bodies on the Vetering circuit as a warning. That picture we're looking at is one of the few images of people sneaking onto the Vetering circuit to lay a Dutch flag over the bodies of the killed. You can imagine this was incredibly hard for Jacoba to live with. When the war was over, she left Amsterdam and she never talked about her experience. Frida spent the rest of the war in Switzerland as a refugee. But when she came back to Amsterdam, this is what she said about it. She felt that nobody wanted to talk about the war, and that because of that, people who had gone along to get along, or worse, collaborated, were in charge. I didn't translate this quote. She actually said it in English. Near the end of her life, she did an interview with the U.S. the U.S. Holocaust Museum. And the reason she did that interview in English is she actually lived in the U.S. for the rest of her life. So I realized, as I'm learning Jacoba and Frida's story, I'm realizing that these stories that we need to tell, that are so important for us to know, this is how they disappear from history. There's still a memorial on the Vetering circuit for the people who were killed. But Jacoba's name was detached from it. And we still talk about the bombing of the city register. There's still a plaque to it. It's still one of the first things, or at least first thing I learned about from the resistance. But Frida's name and Willem's name aren't attached to it anymore. So I should have been upset, right? That my new country is having kind of the same memory issues as my old country. But honestly, I was so inspired. I was so inspired by Jacoba and Frida. And I was so inspired to know that those stories were there. So I kept looking. And the next story I found was something entirely different. She was not written out of history, but she kept getting written over. Kartini was born in Java to an Indonesian who was high-ranking in the Dutch colonial government. So even though there were no schools for girls on Java, Kartini was able to go to school. Her father placed her in the Dutch colonial school. And Kartini was one of those girls that just loves reading. She just soaked up every little bit of information she could get, and she was like, "Give me more, I need more." And so it was kind of a shock when she was 12 years old. Her family actually took her from the school. Because you see, Javanese tradition was when a girl becomes 12, she is isolated in her family home until she marries. Kartini didn't want to get married. She had seen her mother as a lower ranking wife, and she didn't want to have her mother's experience. She didn't want to be part of a polygamous marriage. So she's locked in, and she doesn't know what the exit might look like. This is how she later wrote about it, this desperation of feeling like she was just hitting wall after wall, both literally and metaphorically. And her only lifeline was she started writing letters. So she wrote letters to her classmates. And then, as her network grew, she started writing letters to women all over Indonesia. And then from there, she actually started putting ads for pen pals in newspapers here in the Netherlands. So she had pen pals here as well. You can imagine she just spent all day writing and reading letters. And a lot of these letters were about education and about how she wanted women to be able to be educated. And she started writing articles that got put in various newspapers, advocating for the same thing. And her friends, at one point, even managed to get her a scholarship so she could come and study in the Netherlands. But she couldn't overcome her father's objection. Remember, her father is an official with the very people who control the port, and her father meant more to them than whether or not some girl gets educated. So once again, Kartini hit that wall. And finally, she said, you know what? I'm going to build my own school. So she started teaching girls from Java. Not only was this the first school for girls, this was the first school in Java that taught people of all classes. And she finally agreed to marry someone because she met an official in the nearby province who was a bit of a social critic. And he agreed to support her school. So she finally got to leave the compound. She finally got to maybe walk into a future that she'd like to walk into. Unfortunately, she died in childbirth a year later. Yeah. So she still had friends everywhere who had all of these letters and knew about her desire to start a school. So what her friends decided to do is they said, okay, we're going to publish some of her letters to raise money for this school. So they started by publishing it in Dutch. And if you don't read Dutch, the title of this book was From Darkness to Light, which hopefully should raise your spider sense. And if your spider sense is tingling, you're right. This book took out everything that criticized Dutch colonialism. It was her letters, but highly edited. And then they were translated into English. And if the first title got you worried, the second title should really get you worried. Letters of a Javanese Princess. You can imagine what this means about how these letters were edited. And then, after the Indonesian Revolution, she was put in the pantheon of Indonesian heroes. And her letters were published again. But this time, it included all of her criticism about Dutch colonialism, but it excluded all of her criticism about Javanese society. Anything she said that was unhappy about the traditions she disliked, gone. Her full letters didn't get published until 1987. Yeah. So I really sat with that, right? I felt like Kartini's story was a bit of a warning to me. Because at this point, I had done exactly what I saw my friends' immigrant parents do when I was a kid, which is I had gone all in on my new country. I was so tempted to kind of, not intentionally, but I was so tempted to see these stories in the best light, to put my new country, the Netherlands, in the best light. And Kartini's story was this really great warning of like, hey, I have to be careful. I have to be careful to say what's actually there. And what was kind of incredible is the next story I ran into was one that I feel like I can tell better than her contemporaries, because I grew up with a language for her experience, and her contemporaries didn't have a language for her experience. Okay, so I want to take you guys to 1760s London. Yeah? This is the time of like the big dresses and the corsets and like lots of yammering. Yeah? So one of the things they were yammering about in 1760s London was a former soldier and diplomat named Le Chevalier d'Eon. And for anyone who speaks French, I'm sorry, we're stuck with this. I will do my best. And what was so interesting about d'Eon is that she kind of played with her gender presentation. Now, I think you can tell from the language that I'm using, and because it's International Women's Day, I think that she is the right word to use here. She was born the son of minor nobility, but for reasons that I hope will be clear by the end of the story, I'm going to use she throughout, even at the times of her life where she was in a male guise, yeah? So anyways, at this point, she's in London, she's there as a diplomat, but what people don't know is she's also a spy for the French king. You see, the French king has figured out that his ministers and this huge bureaucracy around him sometimes works for their own interest. And sometimes he doesn't get all the information he needs because this minister wants this to happen or this minister wants this to happen. So what the French king does is he recruits spies like Charlotte. And he recruits them to be like kind of his eyes and ears. And unbeknownst to him, one of the factions at his court finds out about this secret spy ring. And they scheme to send someone to London to replace Charlotte. And Charlotte knows that this guy is going to undermine the French king. So at first she just like point blank refuses. She refuses to go back to France. She refuses to hand over diplomatic papers. And the new guy goes nuts. At one point, Charlotte thinks that he has even tried to assassinate her. So to try to get the French king's attention, she publishes a book. Once again, we're looking at letters being published. But can you imagine how shocking it was when someone published their correspondence with the French king? Of course, everyone in France goes nuts. And everyone in London goes nuts, but in a much better way. Everyone in London is like, who is this person? And the entire time this is happening, d'Eon's also kind of playing with her gender presentation. So betting houses are actually accepting wagers on whether d'Eon is a man or a woman. I cannot imagine the courage it takes to play like this when so much is at stake. In fact, so much is at stake that the next book she tries to publish, the publishers refuse to touch. They're afraid of enraging the French king, except, of course, for the Amsterdam publishers. The Amsterdam publishers will publish anything. So she goes to Amsterdam to publish this very shocking book. And this goes on for years, this back and forth and back and forth. And finally, the French king sends a friend. And this friend negotiates with Charlotte. And one of the things that Charlotte negotiates for her return is that she's coming back as a woman. She does. She actually gets presented at the French court wearing a dress that Marie Antoinette gave to her. So there she is, decadent, presented to the French king, and then she kind of gets exiled to the countryside because she has caused a lot of trouble. And what's so amazing about this story is she never took on a male guise again. The French Revolution happened, and she had to flee because, again, nobility all of a sudden becomes really dangerous. So she flees, and she goes back to London, and she even does these, like, dueling exhibitions, but she does the dueling exhibitions in a dress. And she lives as Charlotte for the rest of her life. And that painting is taken of her when she's, or taken of her, is made of her when she's quite old. But it shows a lot of things. It shows her popularity, and I love the fact that we can actually see her expression and see her eyes. And I love telling this story. There have been a couple times in my life where trans women have they really saved me. Different times, different people, but they really helped me and saved me in a way that I can never pay back. But I really like the idea that maybe in some small, tiny way, by telling Charlotte's story, maybe I can pay them forward a little bit. Because as you guys know, it's so rare to be able to hear a story like this from European history. Trans women have been part of history on all of the continents from way back to ancient times, but it can be hard to find stories from modern European history. So I was really excited to find Charlotte. And I was like, yay! And so I like to tell her story a lot. And then I ran into a story that you guys, I still don't know how to tell. And I'm going to tell you, and maybe tonight will be the night. Maybe in front of you guys, I will finally figure out how to tell this story. I'm not sure that's going to happen. But I feel like we have to talk about Elizabeth Sampson. What she did was so interesting, and the legacy she created was so interesting. This beautiful painting that we're looking at is actually by a modern artist, Iris Kensmil, who's amazing. You should check out her work. But it's part of this triptych that she made of Surinamese figures. And I think there's a reason why Elizabeth was one of the people that she chose for this triptych. So as an American, I kind of grew up thinking that Madam C.J. Walker was like the first Black female millionaire. I know, it was something I thought. Elizabeth Sampson has her beat by about 200 years. So Elizabeth Sampson was born to a formerly enslaved woman. Her elder siblings were children of the plantation owner, and when the plantation owner died, the children were freed, and they figured out how to free Elizabeth's mother. And so Elizabeth was born to a free woman, but Elizabeth was born to a woman who had been enslaved. And she spent a lot of her time growing up in the house of her half-sister and her white Dutch husband. And Elizabeth seems to be one of those people that just like numbers come really easily to, which I will tell you I'm super jealous about, because like I would struggle to figure out Elizabeth's lifetime for just seeing the dates, because I'm that bad at math. But by the time she's 15, Elizabeth is like taking over the bookkeeping for her brother-in-law. And by the time she's 17, she's investing. And she was just kind of part of the elite of the colony. She felt really comfortable there. So when she was 21 years old, and she heard one of the planters refer to the governor using a slur, she told the governor. But there were no witnesses. And the governor wanted someone punished. So instead of the planter being punished, Elizabeth was punished. She was exiled from Suriname. And the document that exiled her said it was a danger to have free Black women in the colony. And I want you to imagine what this must feel like. The only world she knows is one in which it's incredibly vulnerable to be a woman and incredibly dangerous to be Black. And she is both, and she is adrift. I cannot imagine the stuff this woman is made of, because the next thing she does is she gets herself to the Dutch Republic, and she gets her case heard before the Estates General, the highest body in the land. Now, this is a time of corruption and inequality. It takes a lot more than whatever sort of money she was getting from her half-sister and her half-sister's husband. She must have had incredible political savvy to be able to get this to happen. So she goes back to Suriname in triumph, and she slowly, piece by piece, creates a coffee empire with her half-sister. And they end up accumulating so much that Elizabeth is worth more than 1 million guilders. Yeah. At some point, the planter she's living with dies, leaves all of his stuff to her, of course. And when this planter dies, Elizabeth looks around, she's like, I'm 50, I'm about ready to get married. And she sees this nice little pastor. She's like, okay, I'm gonna marry this cute little pastor. And so they go and they file the paperwork with the colonial government, and the colonial government says no, because the pastor's white. So she gets back to the Estates General. And in 1767, Elizabeth Sampson gets the Estates General to rule that anywhere where Dutch law applies, interracial marriage is legal. Or at least that there's no law against it, which is great. It's a huge, huge precedent she set. And then she goes back, she gets married, she passes away shortly after, as you guys can see. And then her estate is kind of frittered away. And then after her estate is frittered away, the story of her kind of disappears. Napoleon invades, overturns the law code, so the legal precedent doesn't matter anymore. And she's just kind of gone. It literally took until the daughter of the first president of a free Suriname recovered this story. She did it first as a historical study and then in historical fiction. But that's how long it took to recover Elizabeth's story. And I think this is a story worth talking about. And I think it's a challenging story, which is why I think Cynthia's told it a bunch of different times. And I don't think I've told it right tonight. And I don't know if I'm ever going to tell it right, because I think you guys all probably heard what I didn't say. That this was an empire built on enslaved labor. This was a time when manumission societies were starting to grow. Just 20 years after Elizabeth, a guy was born who, once he was manumitted himself, once he was freed from slavery himself, he spent the rest of his life working, and with just his labor, he was able to free 129 people. Can you imagine what Elizabeth could have done with 1 million guilders? I don't know how to talk about this, but I think that's part of why we should talk about it, right? We should be talking about these stories that are complicated and that challenge us, and people who are imperfect and flawed and, frankly, kind of interesting. And so I keep trying to tell her story. I don't know, maybe someday. And then the last story I discovered was one in which the woman wasn't ignored or rewritten or forgotten. No. She'd actually taken herself entirely out of the narrative. The story begins, as so many things do, with a 17-year-old girl who was convinced that she was going to change the world. Jo Bonger was growing up on the Wateringskans at a time when it felt like things were shifting. She was able to take much more schooling than she would have been, even if she had been born 10 years earlier. And so she did all this schooling. And then she was able to go to London, where she got to study Percy Shelley, which was like very cool to like hang out in the London library and just be like writing about this very cool poet. And then she comes back to Amsterdam, where the Tachtigers, this very cool art group, are trying to like remake society to a more equal and more generous place. And then, like so many women before her, Jo keeps running into this wall that she can't see, and she doesn't quite know how to get around. She does some translations for some magazines, but nothing really takes off. She does some writing, but I don't know, she kind of compares it to the people she really admires, and she doesn't like her writing. And so she's like, okay, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to change the world by teaching young girls. This is going to be how I make my mark. And so she starts doing it. She starts, teaching at this girls' school, and one after another doesn't quite fit. It's not really the right thing for her. So she did what a lot of us, myself included, have often done in our mid-20s when things aren't quite working out. Yeah, I feel like a lot of women know where this is going. She throws all of her emotional energy into a guy who jerked her around. Hot and cold, I know. I know. I was listening to Lizzo as I was getting ready this morning, and I was hearing Jerome, and I was like, yes, absolutely, come back when you're grown. at 27, Yo is heartbroken and hopeless. She doesn't, literally has no hope. And so she decides she has to leave Amsterdam. She leaves this awful guy, who we might just call Jerome for the rest of the story. She leaves this awful guy, and she goes to Paris to visit her brother. And in Paris, she's reintroduced to her brother's friend, Theo. Now, Theo had visited the year before and had proposed in the space of 4 days. And Yo was like, no, this is too soon. This is too soon. And also, I'm kind of into this guy, but I don't know if that's why I'm saying no, or if it's just that it's too soon. She wrote a lot in her diary about why she actually said no to Theo that first time. But this time they have more time together. And this time when Theo proposes, she says yes. And almost immediately after the proposal, he has to leave her because his brother has had a breakdown. But he comes back, and they go to Amsterdam together, and they get married, and they have this beautiful wedding. And then shortly after the wedding, Theo has to leave again because his brother Vincent has cut his ear off. Yeah, that's where we were going. And so Theo gets Vincent set and settled, and then he comes back to Montmartre, and Yo is just swept up in this whirlwind because Theo is a dealer in modern art. So first of all, she meets an entire museum's worth of amazing artists. And second of all, she gets to be part of this community of people who are really trying to change something. She's in this kind of creative fever dream. And she's pregnant, so she's feeling her child kind of grow as this is happening. It's this very wonderful time for her. And when the child is born, they name him Vincent after his uncle. And when he's a couple months old, Vincent comes to visit. Can you imagine what this must have been like for her? Vincent van Gogh has completely dominated their marriage, but she's never met him. She's heard so much from Theo about him. But you have to imagine what this meeting must have felt like for her. She said that she expected him to be frail, but that he burst into the apartment. It almost sounds like a whirlwind. He ran in, and then he ran out to get olives, and he brought them back and said, oh, you have to share this. We have to enjoy these olives together. She sounds like she was kind of charmed. But it didn't last. You guys know where this story is going. About 6 months later, Vincent did kill himself. And Theo went back and got Vincent buried, and not long after, Theo himself succumbed. First from grief, and then from illness. It's a terribly sad story, and it should also be where this story ends. Theo, as much as he supported Vincent, which he absolutely did, Theo sold one canvas in his life. Vincent had sold a handful of others to family friends. He'd traded canvases with other artists, both for their work or in exchange for art supplies. But Vincent was an incredibly fast painter. He painted sometimes a canvas a day during his manic periods. And almost all of them were packed off to the Dutch countryside with Theo's widow. And that should be it, right? Vincent van Gogh should be a footnote in a PhD thesis about Gauguin. There's art people in the room. I dig it. So why do we know who he is? Yo. In that horrible year after she was widowed, she was in this boarding house in Bussum, and she literally had, I swear to God, imagine this, floor to ceiling, across the ceiling, floor to ceiling, completely surrounded by Vincent's canvases. And she had the letters that the brothers had exchanged. And in that terrible year, she kept reading these letters and getting this idea about who Vincent van Gogh was. She felt like she finally met her brother-in-law for the first time in these letters. And she discovered this man who was passionate about creating something new, about finding truth in art and really showing something that hadn't been expressed in art before. She fell, if not in love, certainly into a deep infatuation or charm with the man in these letters. And as she looked around her 360 view of Van Gogh's art, she realized that's the secret. That is the secret to doing what Yo thought she was meant to do, which is raise a child and finish Teo's work to make Vincent famous. She didn't have a lot, but she knew one art critic. And she cajoled and pleaded and charmed, and she got him to reevaluate Vincent's work using carefully selected pieces of these letters. And then there was one modern novelist who was married to a friend of hers, and she really leaned on that friend. And she got the novelist to kind of join her in saying, yes, this is really good work. And based on just those two recommendations, she made a showing. And based on that exhibition, she made another, and then another. And she was so strategic about it. She would always share these excerpts from the letters so that the critics knew what they were looking at. And she would always send the best canvases, even when they weren't for sale at any price, because she wanted to show off Vincent to the best. And she created this myth of the genius toiling in obscurity. Now, I heard earlier that we've got some art people in the room. So I want you guys to think about the other artists that you know of. Most of them, Caravaggio accepted, most of them had pretty stable lives. They had patrons. They had studios. They had somewhere to work. They had someone paying for their supplies. Most of the artists that you know about were not undiscovered geniuses. Most of the artists that you have been told to admire, or that hopefully you admire yourself, most of those artists were known and recognized during their lifetime. And if that sounds wrong to you, it's because Yo told the story so well that we have completely forgotten that it is a story. In fact, the story that Yo told went so far that it actually reached me as a girl growing up in Minnesota. I heard that story of the genius that is unrespected and toiling in obscurity, but will eventually show itself. And I have to admit, through all those difficult times in my theater life, when I was working so hard to create something, and it felt like it was so hard to get people to see it, and it was so hard to get the shows produced, I have to admit to you, I also relied on that myth that Yo told. So when I discovered this story, I finally made my peace with stories and storytelling. They have incredible power, and we should be wary of that because they have the power to enrage as well as inspire. But because they have all this power, we need to be looking for women like Yo and Elizabeth and Charlotte and Cartini and Frida and Jacoba. We need to find these stories. We need to tell them to each other, and we need to learn from them, because that is how we fix things. Thank you for listening to this. Thank you.